Environment. Resuming debate, the honourable member for Vaughan Woodbridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be splitting my time with my honourable colleague from St. John's South, Mount Pearl. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise today and speak on Bill C-15, the Budget Implementation Bill. Just a short time ago, I had the opportunity to stand and speak on Budget 2016, which I referred to as a middle class, or better yet, a growth budget. I spoke about a budget based on the fundamental principles of investing in and strengthening our middle class, as well as revitalizing the Canadian economy with an historic $120 billion infrastructure investment plan. I also talked about how the budget would help ensure a prosperous future for the residents of my riding of Vaughan Woodbridge, and in fact, of all Canadians. Most importantly, Mr. Speaker, I spoke about how, as a father of two young daughters, Natalia and Eliana, Budget 2016 puts in place a plan for economic growth, not only for today, but for successive generations, that all our children inherit a more prosperous and hopeful country. Well, Bill C-15 is the concrete foundation emanating from the Budget 2016 blueprint. The bill makes real the principles and commitments laid out by our government. The principles of greater tax fairness for Canadians, the belief that we should be there for our seniors to ensure they have a dignified retirement, a firm commitment to families with the introduction of the truly transformational Canada Child Benefit, a large step forward to honour our commitments to Canada's veterans, and significant improvements to the Employment Insurance Act. Mr. Speaker, Bill C-15 also continues to work on strengthening our financial system with the introduction of a bail-in regime for banks that ensures that Canada's banks remain the soundest in the world and that, very importantly, Canadian depositors and taxpayers remain protected. Mr. Speaker, Bill C-15 is a bill containing 15 sections. It had to be substantial because our budget made substantial commitments to Canadians, and the technical underpinnings of these commitments are contained in this piece of legislation. Mr. Speaker, because there is so much to speak about in this bill, I'm going to focus on a few sections. I have stated how proud I am of this government's commitment to families, and Bill C-15 makes good on that commitment by introducing the Canada Child Benefit. The Canada Child Benefit will replace the current system of a Canada Child Tax Benefit and a Universal Care Benefit. This transformational CCB will be simpler, paid monthly, and tax-free to eligible families beginning in July of this year. Mr. Speaker, 9 out of 10 Canadian families will receive more under the Canada Child Benefit than under the current system. Overall, about 3.5 million Canadian families will receive this benefit, with the average increase in child benefits at almost $2,300 annual. Mr. Speaker, independent analysis, and I emphasize independent analysis, indicates that 300,000 fewer Canadian children will be living in poverty in 2016-2017 than in 2014-2015. I am proud to be part of a government that has taken this bold step to build a better and what I believe is a more just and inclusive society. Mr. Speaker, as I've stated repeatedly, seniors built this great country, and we will always be indebted to them. Bill C-15 contains measures to increase the GIS, or Guaranteed Income Supplement, by providing up to an additional $947 per year to our most vulnerable seniors, single seniors, a majority of which are women. Seniors with personal incomes, excluding OAS and GIS payments, benefit between $0 and to $8,400 will see increased benefits. This step will help improve financial security for about 900,000 of our most, again, vulnerable senior Canadians. We should know that Budget 2016 does not, and I repeat, does not impact pension income splitting for seniors. This will remain in effect. A large portion of the Budget Implementation Act addresses regulatory changes to our financial system. There's a very good reason for this emphasis in the legislation. Mr. Speaker, the strength of our economy and the middle class, in large measure, rests on the stability of Canada's financial institutions. Canadians rely on our banks and credit unions on a daily basis for virtually every aspect of their lives. And while the failure of a large Canadian bank is very unlikely, it's still important that authorities have adequate tools to promote and preserve financial stability, as well as to protect taxpayers in a crisis. Canadian banks are amongst, if not I would argue, the soundest in the world. They have robust levels of capital, lending practices that are sound, and stood out as pillars of strength during the 2008 global financial crisis. Mr. Speaker, I had a first-hand view of the global financial crisis and know full well the benefits of sound regulatory environment governing our financial system. And Mr. Speaker, I'd be remiss if I didn't add that while I worked in New York City during the 1990s, that it was a Liberal government under Prime Minister Chrétien and Finance Minister Mr. Martin, that said no to the Canadian banks merging. This decision, I believe, is a major reason why our banks came out of the 2008 global financial crisis with shining colors. The bail-in regime contained in Bill C-15 would strengthen the toolkit and only apply to Canada's domestic, systematically important banks, and allow our regulators to recapitalize a failing bank by converting eligible long-term debt into shares. More importantly, Mr. Speaker, the bail-in regime makes it clear that the shareholders and creditors of Canada's largest banks are responsible for the bank's risks, not taxpayers. This way, Canadians aren't stuck with the tab in the event of an economic crisis. This regime is consistent with the international best practices and standards that were developed following the financial crisis of 2008. And although we have a robust banking sector, the provisions contained in the legislation will provide the legislative framework for the regime with regulations and guidelines to follow. Mr. Speaker, I wish to make clear to all Canadians that insured and non-insured deposits will continue to be protected by the Canadian Deposit Insurance Corporation. In addition to the bail-in provisions, there are also a number of additional technical changes in this legislation which will help strengthen credit unions and the CDIC. Bill C-15 also helps Canadian families by putting into place changes to the Employment Insurance Act, which assists those Canadians impacted by the very unfortunate situation of a job loss. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the changes our government will implement will increase employment insurance payments to unemployed Canadians by $2.5 billion over the next 2 fiscal years. Mr. Speaker, key improvements will include extra weeks of benefits for workers in regions affected by the downturn in commodity prices. In addition, the waiting period will be reduced from 2 weeks to 1 week and will provide unemployed workers with hundreds of dollars more at the time they need it most. Mr. Speaker, our government will work and create the conditions for all Canadians to find meaningful employment. That is what we want. But we must ensure a system that provides help for when Canadians and their families require it. During the election campaign, one of our key commitments was to greater tax fairness for middle-class Canadians and all Canadians. Mr. Speaker, our government has also introduced a bill, C2, that lowers the income tax rate for middle-class Canadians. Today, over 9 million Canadians are benefiting from lower taxes, with a total tax reduction at approximately $3.4 billion.
Here. Good stuff.
Bill C-15 even provides further tax fairness measures, with amendments to the Income Tax Act contained in the first 3 sections of the bill. For example, we've added insulin pills and needles, feminine hygiene products, as well as catheters to a list of items that are exempt from GST/HST. The budget bill contains provisions that increases the maximum benefit under the Northern Residence Deduction, exempts taxable income amounts received as rate assistance under the Ontario Electricity Support Program, and, quite proudly, introduces a teacher and early childhood educator school supply tax credit. This measure alone will provide a benefit of $140 million over 5 years in tax relief to our educators. These are just a few examples of the elements contained in Bill C-15. As I had previously stated, Budget 2016, the middle class or growth budget, provided a blueprint for a hopeful future for all Canadians. Bill C-15, Mr. Speaker, is a solid legislative foundation for the future. I hope my colleagues on all sides of the aisle will join with me in supporting this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to offer, first of all, congratulations to the member's speech, but also a comment and then a quick question. First of all, in regards to the bank recapitalization provisions of this budget, obviously this is a newer idea. What might be a good suggestion, I'd like to see here the members' comments, would be to have the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions to make public stress tests so that the public and the people that invest in banks can know that the banks that they invest in or are trading on are at the highest standards. The question I have for this member, I've heard a few Liberals mention today that this recapitalization regime meets international standards. First of all, can he name one country that utilizes it? And then second of all, Mr. Speaker, the second question is, in regards to the capitalization scheme, it's never been used. Does he agree that there is some trepidation, the fact that the next time there's a financial crisis where this may be used, that this would be the first trial, I think, in the world of such a bail-in regime? And is he concerned about that?
The Honourable Member for Vaughan Woodbridge.
No, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank my honourable colleague for that comment. As we all know, in the 2008 financial crisis, one of the impacts was, for example, the United States injecting capital or equity into their banks to boost their banks, and the same situation also happened in Europe. From that, we had what was called contingent COCOs or bail-in securities created, where taxpayers would not be on the hook. This came out of the G20, the G8, the FASB, many international organizations where it was determined that taxpayers would no longer face the risk in case of a too big to fail situation, where creditors and equity holders would face the risk of a recapitalization. Contingent securities are in effect across Europe, Switzerland, the UK, Italy, Germany, France. They have been issued. They are traded in the market. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question commentaire. Alors, la députée de Saint-Hyacinthe.
The Honourable Member for Saint-Hyacinthe-Bégotte. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Était dans l'opposition.
When the Liberals were in opposition, they criticized the omnibus bills, and they called them, in fact, a bad thing to do. But this time here, we're looking at a very large bill. I don't know how they can be proud of a bill with 169 pages, which amends some 30 individual pieces of legislation under many different departments, and it has an impact on several others. It would make retroactive changes to other legislation as well. My question for my colleague opposite is this. He says he's very proud of banks, but does he not think that a complete chapter on recapitalization of banks wouldn't warrant a much deeper study instead of simply putting it into an omnibus piece of legislation?
Bridge.
I thank my honourable colleague for her question. What I will say is this piece of legislation, Bill C-15, contains many of the measures that were in our platform and obviously came into effect into our budget. So we are obviously producing a piece of legislation that fulfills our commitments to not only members of the House but to Canadians entirely across this country. So I will leave it at that. In terms of our banks, I'm very proud to say that Canada has the soundest banks in the world that employ literally hundreds of thousands of Canadians from coast to coast to coast. And we want to maintain and ensure that our financial system is still the soundest going forward. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Toronto Danforth.
Mr. Speaker, what I would like to ask my friend is that given that last week MPs were all back in our home ridings and having the opportunity to speak with our constituents, what he heard from his constituents as to what were the greatest needs from young families or from seniors, and how this budget might actually help to solve some of the problems that they're facing.
The Honourable Member for Vaughan Woodbridge.
Thank you to my honourable colleague from Toronto Danforth. What I would like to say is that many young families in my riding are looking forward to receiving tax-free checks on a monthly basis beginning in July, with an average increase of $2,300. That also transpired to 9 out of 10 families that currently receive the UCCB and the Canada Child Tax Credit receiving higher payments. I believe for the province of Ontario alone, over the next 2 years, the increased payment amount will total $4 billion. That's $4 billion going directly to the pockets of residents in the province of Ontario. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for St. John's South, Mount Pearl.